Shalom, friends. I'm Rabbi Steve Wiseman from Temple Solel here in Bowie, Maryland, and this is the next in our continuing series of videos in our Judaism Unplugged effort, entitled Pretty Fly for a Rabbi. In today's video, we'll be looking at Jewish texts continuing from our discussion of Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, this time looking at the derivation of new sacred Jewish texts after the canonization of Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, the work particularly of the rabbis in the early period. Some of this material we've already covered both under the historical videos and in the discussion of the history of the holiday of Hanukkah, because the rabbis figure there significantly as well. But I think it's important to start with that understanding of the people behind these texts, particularly the texts we call Mishnah, Talmud, and the genre of text known as Midrash. So when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, they brought about an end to the era in which Jews worshipped God by bringing animal or vegetable, grain usually, sacrifices physically to be offered up on their behalf by a dedicated priesthood. With the destruction of the temple and the altar on which those sacrifices were made, Judaism found itself in a time of significant crisis, much as it had at the time of the destruction of the First Temple about 600 years earlier. This time, however, few, if any, captives were taken out of what today we refer to as Israel and brought back to Rome. Instead, the Romans sacked the city of Jerusalem and further restricted the freedom of the Jews there. By destroying the temple, they felt that they were destroying the religious center that kept the Jewish people together. Perhaps unbeknownst to the Romans, but probably not, there had been a significant challenge mounting to the old-time religion and to the religious power of the temple and the priesthood for a period going back probably a couple of hundred years or more already. At the time, the challengers were called Pharisees, from the Hebrew word for outsiders. And from that, you can tell that they did not give themselves that name, that name was bestowed upon them by those who were in power. The Pharisees appear on the scene shortly after there is a break in the support for the Hasmonean dynasty in about the year 63 BCE, when a group of their more religious supporters, who were called the Hasidim, the pious ones, could no longer stand what they saw as the watering down of the Jewish nature of the Hasmonean dynasty with the import of so many foreigners and so many Jews by choice. And so they broke their ties with the Hasmonean dynasty and weakened it significantly enough that the Roman leaders traveling down to Egypt were concerned enough about the stability of the region to end the Hasmonean dynasty and to place appointed governors over Jerusalem and over the Jewish people gathered in the land. As soon as the Hasidim break with the Hasmoneans, that is when the Pharisees, the Pharisheim in Hebrew, appear on the scene. And there are many scholars who believe that the Pharisees were nothing more than the Hasidim after they broke with the Hasmoneans, thus going from being the pious insiders to being the outsiders that Pharisees represented. What the Pharisees also represented was a very different approach to Judaism, one that was not centralized at the temple and at the altar, one that was localized, one that did not require sacrifice, because all Jews, whether Pharisees or otherwise, were already required to sacrifice. So the Pharisees instead started to spread their word locally through wandering preachers and teachers. And for those of you who come to these videos from a Christian background, if that description of a wandering preacher and teacher sounds a lot like the way you understand Jesus, there's a good reason for that. So these Pharisees were providing Jewish knowledge, Jewish teaching. They were providing localized leadership at a time when the centralized leadership was growing more and more out of touch with the changing reality in the countryside and in Jerusalem itself, as Judaism was moving from being an agriculturally based society to much more of a urban or pre-urban society of towns and villages, with people entering into crafts and shops instead of working the land for themselves. And as a result, when the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 CE and put an end to the leadership of the priests and the role of the altar and the sacrifices, in all likelihood, what they were doing was expediting a victory that would have eventually come to the Pharisees anyway, because theirs was the more attractive brand and the more connected brand of Judaism and form of Judaism to the people in that time. But with the destruction of the temple, it forced the Pharisees into a position of leadership, forced them to make significant change, the norm within Judaism, instead of as an alternative on top of the old-time religion. And so there followed a period of over a century or so of reformulation, of thoughtful reconsideration of what Judaism could look like and needed to be. There also came with that history a name change for the Pharisees, who were now free to call themselves what they wanted to be called, and decided that they wanted to be called rabbis, teachers, more in keeping with their role within the community than with a location that was assigned to them by somebody else who was in power. And these rabbis developed new approaches to text, new rituals, a new understanding. They were already dealing with the changed reality of Jewish life, which was making sacrifice harder and harder for more Jews. But they continued to build upon their decentralized model, their localized model, built around localized preachers and teachers. By the time they got to about the year 200 CE, when it was clear that the temple was not going to be rebuilt anytime soon, when it was clear that the Romans were not going to give us a lot of freedom, but just enough, when a significant number of Jews had left the Holy Land and gone back into diaspora, particularly back towards Babylonia, where some Jews had never left in the first place, it was clear that what was needed was a new basic understanding of Jewish law. Not one that would replace the laws that came from the Torah and from Tanakh, but one which codified them better, organized them better, explained them better. And so by 200 CE, the rabbis had created a document that they called Mishnah, a second law. They called it the oral law to distinguish it from the written law that had been written down and passed down in written form through the generations. They were not claiming to have discovered something new or created something new, but rather to have put into writing those oral elements of Jewish law that had been passed down without being written down for years. There are some significant issues with that claim, not the least of which is the reality if you ever played the game of telephone as a young person. Imagine playing telephone not with 5 or 6 people in a line standing next to each other, immediately repeating the very brief message to great comedic result when it is totally mangled by the time it comes out the other end of the line. But imagine traditions being passed over the generations orally, from parent to child, with a lifetime in between receiving and transmitting. And the transmission of far more material than just a cute, clever, difficult to pass on line through the game of telephone. And add to that the fact that most of the new laws of the Mishnah were remarkably useful for this new merchant-based, artisan-based, village and town-based Judaism that really hadn't existed during the period when, as an oral tradition, this would have been passed down. So the odds of things changing dramatically and getting lost in the transmission was immense. And what the Mishnah is a very organized and very detailed collection of Jewish law and teaching. So clearly the rabbis were almost assuredly the source for this. But they weren't creating out of broad cloth. Every law that they placed on the table as part of the Mishnah was based in a teaching, a verse at least, of Torah. We call them proof texts. And they were given alongside the law. In some cases, laws were lifted from Torah and Tanakh and simply repeated and codified with very little need for change. In other cases, significant reworking was done. I'll give a couple of examples of those in a minute. The Mishnah as a document was broken into 6 subsections, 6 orders, as they're called. The first of these orders, Zeraim, dealt with agricultural law because there were still agricultural Jews, and because even as the rabbis were adapting Judaism for a new reality, they were also maintaining a messianic hope that there would come a time when the temple and its sacrificial cult would be worthy of being reestablished, and therefore keeping alive the agricultural laws that supported that system was important, even if it was no longer relevant. And so their collection of laws in Mishnah begins with the section called Zeraim, seeds literally, dealing with all the agricultural laws. But interestingly, the section of Zeraim itself begins with first the Book of Brachot, in which the rabbis establish prayer as the new form of worship. So they're doing both at the same time, maintaining what was necessary to maintain of the old system to make it attractive to the former supporters of the Pharisees to join them and see it as legitimate, but also replacing sacrifice with prayer, all in that first order. The second order of the Mishnah is Moed, which means festival or sacred time. And it's the laws for all of the holidays and festivals and observances. The third section deals with Nashim, and is called Nashim, which is laws relating to women. Still not given equality in the society, but the recognition that there were laws that particularly applied to women and how they were treated by men. Fourth section was a section on tort law, on damages, called Nezikin. The fifth section was called Kedoshim, or Kodashim, section dealing with holy objects, sacred ideas and rituals that weren't covered in any of the other material. And finally, the last of the 6 orders, Taharot, were purity, dealing with things like purity in relationships of the family, individual purity, purity before God, purity in the marketplace and in the community. Those 6 orders organized the material. And within those 6 orders, there were 63 different books, a significant body of law. Each individual law was called a halakha. And as we noted, it was based upon a verse or a teaching from Torah, from Tanakh, as its basis. So, the first book in the section on festivals and holy days is the Book of Shabbat. Shabbat is a biblical concept. It's a 7th day of rest. We're told that no work is to be done, but in the rabbi's era, the question now became, as our society changes and the roles we play in it to make a living change, how do we define work? And the rabbis took a very unusual approach. They looked at the story of the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness as the sacred holy place, and extended it by looking at the material in Nevi'im about the creation of the temple in Jerusalem under Solomon. And they distilled from those 2 stories 39 different labors that were clearly involved in the establishment of the sacred spaces. And because there was a text in connection to the specs for the tabernacle that God gave to Moses to bring to the people, in which the covenant of Shabbat was raised, again with its statement that no labor is to be done on the 7th day, the rabbis, by that juxtaposition, took the labors involved in building the tabernacle and the temple and declared that those were the labors that were forbidden on Shabbat. And over the years, as new technology, as life has changed, have come into play, that's still the yardstick that traditional Jews use. So when you hear an Orthodox Jew say they cannot drive their automobile on Shabbat, it's because one of those 39 labors that were seen to be part of building the tabernacle was the creation of a fire. The spark plugs in your engine, in your car, turn the fuel into flame. They spark and create flame. And that's what powers your vehicle. And yes, there are other engines that do not need and use spark plugs. But here's another thing that the rabbis were very good at doing. They were very good at protecting the details of the law. So if the law said you need to give 3 items or 3 measures of an item, the rabbis would say give 4, just to make sure you weren't shortchanging. Maybe one of your 3 measures was short. They called this building a fence around the Torah, not around the Mishnah, around the Torah, to protect the original laws of the Torah as they were reinterpreting them. We see this particularly in the Jewish calendar, where 7-day holidays become 8 days, and single-day holidays that are not fast days get celebrated for 2 days, to make sure that either the first or the first 7 days or the last 7 days are the correct ones on the calendar. A holdover from a time when telling time was not the exact science it is for us today. All part of that building a fence around the Torah, which was a central piece of the rabbinic ideology. So you get these new interpretations and these new rules coming from the old rules, applying better to the life that was being lived by Jews in the time of the rabbis. And as soon as the rabbis released this document called Mishnah in 200, it too becomes canonized. It becomes locked and elevated in holiness. Nothing new can be added to it. But it also becomes the centerpiece of teaching and training in the yeshivot in which the next generation of rabbis are being taught to be leaders, religious leaders and communal leaders. And so there develops, much as in modern academia today, a collection around the original material of the Mishnah that is a compilation of the debates and discussions about what it means and how to apply it. And in fact, there are two distinct sets of this material, which has the technical name of Gemara, of explanation. One that developed in the academies in what was Judea and Israel. The other developed in the academies of Babylonia in the diaspora, in the exile. One referring to life still in the land, the other living life in exile. After a couple of hundred years of compilation in Babylonia, there was enough of this Gemara material that the original Mishnah was expanded into a much larger document called the Talmud. And this was done by adding the Gemara to the original texts and having both of them together in a single collection. Same 6 orders to organize the Talmud as in the Mishnah, but each of the books is now much larger because it's not only the original laws, but it's a couple of hundred years of debates and discussions of interpretation and application of those laws. And so what was 6 books together in the Mishnah now becomes 63 volumes, one for each of the books in each of the orders of the Mishnah, each of them dramatically larger than anything in the original Mishnah. So a small pamphlet on the laws for Passover becomes a very large folio of a couple of 100 sides of pages of explanation. And the compilation of this Gemara material is remarkably similar both to the phenomenon of used textbooks at the college and university level, where you get not only the original text, but one or more previous students' notes on the text itself, what was important and what wasn't for the exam, the notes from the discussions that explain things that were written into the margins, the references to other places to look, what have you. And so in the Gemara, we end up with material and discussions that look like students from different generations who never met each other because they were never alive at the same time are actually debating with each other over how to interpret a particular verse here and there. That's how all the material came to be organized over the course of time. The other thing it resembles is modern HTML text for our computers. The ability to click from one place to another by a link between the two is very much the same phenomenon that's being used to organize the material in the Talmud, only without the technology behind it. So if one looks at a page of text, of classic text, particularly of Talmudic text, in the center of the page in large letters is a piece of the original text of Mishnah and Gemara following it. And then around the sides of the page are commentaries and discussions on the discussions that make up the Gemara. Definitions and other footnotes and afternotes and what have you. And so you've got layer upon layer of text where you're just looking at the text and being able to hop from point A to point B to point C on the page and get a sense of what's happening in the main text. Now, the Talmud in particular has one significant logical flaw. In order to follow it and learn it in the best way possible, the assumption is that you've already read it before you begin to study it, because the references to other material within it start almost immediately. You don't really get a warm-up period to get acclimated before you're jumping all over the place, cross-referencing and reading other things. In some ways, it's very much like trying to read the encyclopedia cover to cover. It can be very informative if you do, but more likely you'll read until you find something that captures your interest, and you'll jump to something related to that that is suggested, and you'll bounce around the text, probably ending up skipping significant portions and focusing on the things that matter the most to you. Now, at the same time that was happening in the exile in Babylonia, and Talmud was codified there and written down probably by the 6th century, because the Jewish community left behind in what was now being called Palestine by the Romans was smaller. It took them longer to build up the critical mass to add their Gemara to the same Mishnah that both Talmuds are based upon, and come up with what's known as the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud. That happened in about the 8th century. And so you have these two Talmuds, the Palestinian or Jerusalem and the Babylonian. With most of the Jewish world living in exile, if you were a community in exile and you had a question that you had to send back to one of the academies for an answer from the Talmud, then you probably sent your message to Babylonia, because the Babylonian Talmud had the benefit of at least already having taken into living in exile into consideration in their interpretations. And so as a result, it's the Babylonian Talmud that becomes the significant Talmud. And when you hear people just refer to Talmud, they're probably referring to the Babylonian. In order to make a reference to something out of the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud, you have to specify that it's from the Jerusalem Talmud. But that's why the Babylonian becomes the more significant, because it's the more relevant to most of the Jews of the time. Now, not all of the discussions in the Gemara are laser focused on the text in question. There's a significant amount of tangential material from discussions that the rabbis go into based upon where they take the original text. So if the original question is, what is the appropriate blessing for the lighting of Shabbat candles? And an entire long discussion ensues, particularly a difficult discussion, because no place in Torah are we told to light candles to mark Shabbat. So the rabbis have their work cut out for them in finding proof texts from the Torah to justify their positions. As that discussion is coming to a close, the related question, okay, now that think we've resolved that, what's the proper blessing for when we light candles on a Hanukkah menorah? Which was politically even a more challenging question to the rabbis. And so that whole discussion of rituals and blessings for Hanukkah comes as a tangent in the Talmudic collection on Shabbat, because that's where the rabbis came to it, and because there was no original Mishnaic material to base it on. So you have this whole collection of legal texts within Mishnah and Talmud, halachic texts that explain halakha, individual laws, but you also get these explanatory story preaching texts that go with them as well, not nearly as clearly connected to a verse. Stories and examples that explain some of the laws and some of the morality through the behavior of recognizable biblical characters. These are called agadah, or lore, as opposed to law, and eventually come to be seen as their own separate material gathered together out of Talmud into the genre called midrash, or preaching material. So if you think of Aesop's fables, each of which has a moral lesson to teach at the end of a cute and memorable story. For those who come to this from the Christian tradition, the parables of the New Testament, these are examples of midrash, of the genre of midrash. And a large source of the midrashic material is the Agadah portions of the Gemara. And so once you have the two Talmuds, you then have rabbis, preachers, teachers, either taking material out of those texts and using it to tell stories and teach directly, or basing their own created stories and fables and parables that they use to teach lessons on that material. And this material is getting collected separately into volumes of midrash. So you have this tremendous creativity in development of all of these second generation texts of Mishnah and Talmud and then midrashic materials going on for about 1,000 years. And when we get to the second millennium of the Common Era, things start to change again. That's when we start to get the medieval commentators on the Hebrew Bible and on the Talmud, adding their interpretations directly to those texts in the margins. That's when we get more translations into more languages as we move into new lands and learn new languages as Jews in new places. That's where eventually the generalized legal text of the Talmud starts to get localized and specified for the unique realities of different communities, particularly throughout the diaspora, in more localized legal codes. And that's all the precursor to what we get to in the modern world, in which we get into the sectarian Jewish world of Reform and Conservative and Orthodox and what have you, in which for many of us, the book that we are the people of the book of has become the prayer book more than any of these earlier texts. And again, the development of the prayer tradition in the modern world takes some of these other documents in new and different directions, as we saw in the creation of things like Haftarah. And so we'll leave this discussion here for now with this background on Mishnah and Talmud and Midrash. As always, if there are questions or comments, we invite you to share them through the Temple Solel website. Happy to answer them. And until we come back again with the next video in the series, I'll bid you shalom, friends, for now. Be well.